fascinating topic for trade wonks everywhere about the impacts of a trade war, but certainly it has implications for the broader U.S. economy, which is part of the reason for having the discussion this morning. I will just do a very brief run through of who we have on the panel so that everyone has a sense of the industries that are covered. We have going down the road Dooley, who is President and CEO of the American Chemistry Council, Dean Garfield, President and CEO of the Information and Technology Industry Council. I usually just call you ITI, so that's a lot. Rolls off the end. Julia Hughes, President of the United States Fashion Industry Association. Tom Sleight, President and CEO of the U.S. Brains Council, and Scott Paul, President of the Alliance of American Manufacturing. Now, for probably most of you know in this room, this actually gives us a pretty good diversity of issues. Scott and I talked earlier, and I put him at the end because he will have a slightly different view on some of these issues. But I think actually the one thing that you will find that probably unites everyone on this platform is an agreement that there are significant challenges with China that need to be addressed. And so really the question for each industry is, what does that look like? So let me just kick everything off with folks. I think we agreed that everybody would have between 6 and 7 minutes, although Dean, you said you might be quicker than that. The question of the panel is, what are the impacts of a trade war? But let me add an additional question for you to consider as you're going through, and that is, are we in a trade war? Cal.
Well, let me start off by just saying I'm just delighted to be seeing Rick and Charles Boustany, and one of the proudest things I had during my tenure in Congress was being one of the more pro-trade members there. And I have the good fortune now of working with the American Chemistry Council, and we represent the industrial chemical manufacturers in the United States. And we're also one of the more pro-trade industries, certainly in the country. A lot of folks don't realize that about 14 cents of every dollar of U.S. exports is constituted by the chemical industry. And our fortunes are only going to increase. If you look at who is the primary benefactor of the increased supplies of natural gas in the United States, it's the chemical industry. And Charles' district in Louisiana was a good example of that. So what we've seen happen in a little over a decade is that the U.S. chemical industry has gone from one of the high-cost manufacturers of chemicals globally to now the world's most competitive manufacturer of chemicals. And that has led to a flood of new investment coming into the United States. We have about almost $200 billion in new investment in capital manufacturing of chemicals in the United States. Importantly, 62% of that is foreign direct investment. Companies, whether they're chemical companies, whether they're Europe, whether they're Asia, whether they're South America, all recognize that the U.S. is the most competitive global platform to manufacture chemicals. And so that is very important to what we see on this discussion of trade policy in the United States today, because currently we are already competing and winning in chemicals globally. We have a positive trade surplus in chemicals of about $32 billion right now in the industrial chemicals. We project, because of this enhanced investment that we see coming into the United States and our enhanced competitiveness, that by the year 2022, that is going to increase more than twofold to about $73 billion. But that is also predicated that we have sound trade policies that allow us to maximize the market opportunities we have and capitalize on this global competitive advantage that we currently enjoy. So when we see this administration deploying trade policies as they've done with their 232s or their 301s, it is oftentimes driven by an objective, I think, to try to provide a level of protection and support to some of the least competitive sectors of our economy. And we shouldn't be surprised when you take this approach on steel and aluminum on the 232s that it results in a retaliation. And who is China? Who is Japan? Who is Europe? Who is all the other countries that have been adversely impacted by the increase in the unilateral increase in the tariffs that we are imposing? It's going to be the chemical sector. It's going to be the technology sector. It's going to be the ag sector, who already in the United States are global leaders who are competing and winning. And so what we are troubled with is when we see what has been the response to China with their 301s, is that 40% of the tariffs retaliatory tariffs that they have proposed target the chemical sector. You know, we project that that is going to have an impact. We have about 11 billion in exports to China right now in chemicals. We anticipate that if these retaliatory tariffs went in place, it would have an impact of about $3 billion. Now that's not, you know, going to make or break it, our industry. But when you combine that with what we could see happening with the retaliations in other major markets that we serve, it becomes very, very problematic. And the issue that we're most concerned with is that this unilateral approach is being advanced by this administration is not going to be, we think, it's not going to, you know, we think it suffers from the lack of clear metrics. And how do you define success? You know, from our perspective, it ought to be put in that context of what Rick Larsen was talking about in economic policy, that you would be doing a comprehensive analysis in terms of, is this creating an increase in exports? Is this creating greater economic opportunities across our economy? And I can tell you with great certainty that if you keep going down this path, when you see these retaliatory tariffs that could be imposed, it's going to have an adverse impact on those sectors of the U.S. economy that are most competitive and are clearly now global winners in trade. And so we hope that we will see, you know, a more of a coalition approach. And the only thing that's resulted with the administration's policy to date is that they're establishing a coalition. There's a coalition of other countries that are coming together to target, you know, our, you know, most competitive sectors. So we are very concerned. We've already identified in terms of the 301s where we would suffer. And so we hope that we will see, you know, hopefully common sense prevail here and take a much different approach, and one which is really based on a set of metrics in terms of what is going to advance the broader economic interests across the entire U.S. economy.
I largely agree with Cal and Congressman Larsen, but I won't be that brief. So I'll answer both of your questions and make 5 quick points. Yes, we are in a trade war. We have been for quite a period of time. That trade war has been largely one-sided and largely been won and winning by the Chinese. The president's policies don't help, or approach to date. First point is, I think China has significantly abused the privilege of being a member of the WTO. They've not lived up to the obligations and commitments they've met. 2, for the last 10 years, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to gain leverage with the Chinese and debating whether the U.S. in fact has leverage in spite of a nearly $16 trillion economy. There is now leverage. And the question is, what does the administration do with it? Third, tariffs are not the way to advance that leverage. Tariffs have failed in every instance that they've been attempted in the modern economy. So when the president rolled out tariffs, he pointed to President McKinley, ignored the fact that the taxes and tariffs that McKinley advanced were almost immediately reversed. McKinley lost his seat in the House. Republicans lost both houses of Congress. Smoot-Hawley, same thing. They were both out of Congress within 2 years. Chicken taxes, same thing. The Reagan taxes, same thing. Tariffs fail in the modern economy for a whole host of reasons, including the points that Cal was making. Fourth, the way to advance the leverage that the United States has gained is by, as Cal pointed out, working in a multinational fashion to ensure that China lives up to the commitments they've made as a part of the WTO, which is granting fair and full access to their market, which they've not done. And over the course of the panel, we can go through all of the areas which have been problematic. And fifth and final, consistent with what Congressman Larsen said, there are important things that the United States has to do, should be doing, and hasn't done in the context of making sure that it's in a position to compete and compete effectively, including rethinking the decision not to be a part of TPP, which just doesn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense when Senator Clinton suggested it. It certainly didn't make any sense when President Trump has reinforced it. It actually undermines leverage and our ability to achieve the things that need to be achieved, both for the tech sector and the economy more broadly.
Thanks. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack and talk. So the U.S. fashion industry, we represent global brands and retailers with our motto, fashion made possible by global trade. So, because we're looking at this, it's global. It's not just what's happening in the U.S., it's what's happening in economies all around the world. So our members source all over the world. They sell all over the world. But this is a big issue for all of us. And to kind of build on what Dean is talking about, we're kind of the poster child for how high tariffs don't work. And that's not where I was going to start here, but it flows nicely because we have some of the highest tariffs still in the tariff schedule. So we have tariffs that go into the 30s for man-made fiber apparel. If we're looking at footwear, we have tariffs that go even higher. So we're every day already paying the tariffs, and that's part of why we have been so engaged on the 301 discussions, even though our products aren't on the initial list. We've heard we're on that second list, if that second list ever comes. But we kind of show you that having high tariffs isn't actually the way to keep the production here in the US, indeed quite the opposite. And instead, what our industry has done, and we did this after the global quota system was finally lifted, where we had that additional level of protection for so many decades and still saw domestic production fall and change because, I think in part because of the high level of protection, that now we're creating jobs in the US that are higher paying, better jobs through global value chains. And what we did we've had 2 different surveys of members, retailers and brands looking at how much is the value here in the US for imported garments. So for a 100% imported garment, 70% of that value is created here in the US. And I know everyone talks about the iPod study, but for us, apparel is another example of that, and those are the jobs that we see at risk when we're talking about things like 301 retaliation that would be affecting our sector. So, and those are exactly the jobs that we need to keep the economy going forward. We want to be the leaders in e-commerce and in design and in product development and in textile research, not cede that to the rest of the world. So just a few words then on China, because China is important to us as well. So China is the top supplier of apparel to the US, top supplier of footwear to the US, top supplier of textiles to the US. There's kind of a theme here that we buy a lot, we source a lot from China that's used to manufacture here in the US, or that we're selling it here in the US. So the idea that we're going to start a trade war and we're going to add additional duties on products that are not easily available elsewhere, and some folks say we'll go to Vietnam. Well, yeah, well, we don't have TPP, so that's really not where we're able to go for other alternatives. I think reflects the sourcing dynamic and kind of the uncertainty and the lack of what I would call strategy for the long term, which I think the Congressman hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned, that instead of complaining just about Belt and Road, where's our strategy? We should be having strategies too for what we want to promote, and to deal with the issues that we're having with China, we need a multilateral approach to really solve the problem, because bilaterally, the US and China, that's not going to solve what's going on in China. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. It's not a competition, but we were facing 178.6% anti-dumping duty on one of our products.
Dumping's a different case.
My name is Tom Sleight. I'm with the U.S. Grains Council. This is for you who don't know who we are. We are the export market development organization that works mainly on export market development for U.S. corn, sorghum, barley, and their co-products, which include things like dried distillers grain, which is a byproduct of the ethanol industry. If you drive your car, you're familiar with ethanol, and ethanol itself, as well as things like malt and flour, sorghum flour. Real quickly, that's where we are. And are we in a trade war? I can show you the bruises if you want to. Yeah, we in agriculture, we're there. We are in the crosshairs right now, particularly with China. Our organization started working in China in 1982. I started working on China programs myself in 1983. I learned a long time ago not to poll the audience who wasn't born in 1983. That's really depressing exercise. But anyway, we've been there for a long time in robust cooperation in the development of industries in our mutual interest between China and the United States agriculture. Every product every product that I work with and represent over this time period since the 1980s, actually more or less in the 90s and the 2000s, China has been a number one, number two, at worst a number three product for all of our export market for all the products that I represent. Every 2 weeks we get together with our organization. We have 10 offices around the world, and we get together every 2 weeks with our directors. We do an early morning phone call. A lot of people don't like it because they have to get up really early, but we went around the world. What's going on? Mexico said, wow, got really good purchases of grain. It's been a good month for us. Southeast Asia, really robust exports going into places like Vietnam, even some going into Indonesia. Egypt is buying U.S. grain like crazy right now. We turned to our China director, and he started off just a couple hours ago saying, I have nothing to report on trade. It's sort of funny, but the reality is, for everything that we represent, the China market has been cut off, either by exorbitant tariffs, prohibitive policies on things like biotechnology that make it very difficult for us to export our products in terms of sanitary, phytosanitary agreements and things like that, or just flat out, tariffs in response to the steel and aluminum thing. We have already hit it. In fact, we can probably be on your next panel here in terms of the war room thing, because that's exactly what we've been doing over the past several months. Is what do we do about this? U.S. grains, in particular sorghum and corn, have been targeted. Low-hanging fruit. These are significant exports. Sorghum itself was $1 billion plus market export for U.S. sorghum. But they've been targeted because the very political reality of a lot of President Trump's support is in farm country, and it has created a lot of, and so countries, particularly China, have known very well, they do their homework, if we can target some of these products in farm country, maybe we can get some negative opinions on this moving along and pressure on the White House to get solutions. And so yeah, that's a big reality. Right now, with the negotiations that are going on, somewhere between China and the United States, there's a lot of optimism in agriculture right now because, some of the reports have said agricultural issues are on the table. A person we know very well, the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, has come to Washington. People are very, very hopeful that we'll get back to business. I'm not too sure I want to get too optimistic yet until we hear how things are going on. But for U.S. agriculture, they are at the tip of the spear. But one of the things that's happened, the products that we've been shut out on, is they've gone other places in the world. And they've been able to make up that volume, albeit at a much lower cost. And so these are things that are affecting farmers. Farmers are going to have to be extremely competitive. They're going to have to be the low-cost supplier. And in some cases, maybe even a residual supplier, things that have us very, very concerned in agriculture. Now let me stop there.
Thanks. So I'm Scott Paul, President of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. We're a partnership between the Steelworkers Union and some of its domestic manufacturing partners. I don't find a lot to disagree with other than the efficacy of tariffs. But I want to start with an anecdote. About 4 years ago, almost to the day, May 19th, in the Western District of Pennsylvania, charges were filed against 5 Chinese military officers for computer hacking and economic espionage against U.S. Steel, Alcoa, Westinghouse, Solar World, Allegheny Technologies, and the United Steelworkers. And there was, I encourage you to read the unsealed indictment, because it goes into extraordinary detail about the extent to which the state-controlled apparatus in China was trying to glean new technologies, in particular high-strength steel, that they were unable to develop domestically, and other sorts of technologies. And all of these companies suffered market share losses, losses in profits, certainly losses in terms of employment that were deeply felt. So this is a very real war in a much more literal sense than I think many of us are talking about. And those officers will never face trial. They're never going to come to the United States. The Chinese government is never going to give them up. But it gets to the point of what is an effective way to deal with this. I think somehow imagining that China, after 17 years of non-compliance with WTO rules, is suddenly going to reverse and do it, is the definition of insanity. It really is, because this has been kind of the expectation that we, as kind of a lawyer-led, rules-based society, have laid out, and it's a completely unreasonable expectation, I believe. And so, do we capitulate? Do we push back in some ways? And I think that tariffs have to be a part of that arsenal. In the case of the intellectual property 301 case, I think that they should be considered as being a means to an end. The end result is not to have tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, that are escalating and spiraling, but they should result in some sort of change. And Dean referenced some of the tariff actions. I would argue one of the outcomes of our experience from the 1980s is that we saw a lot more FDI from Japan in the United States after that pushback. And it's one of the reasons why you have Toyotas and Hondas that are made in the United States as well as Japan now. Together with Sematech, it's one of the reasons why the semiconductor in particular has had much more of a domestic manufacturing footprint that survived as opposed to some other sectors in electronics. And so I wouldn't discount their efficacy if they're used wisely. Now, can this administration use them wisely? I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that you can't run an effective trade policy through ambiguity or through Twitter. Those are not effective approaches. And the ZTE tweet is just, it's indefensible, it's alarming, it's really baffling to me, as I think Congressman Larsen indicated. But I do think that we need to keep in mind, with respect to intellectual property, and the administration did lay this out, although it gets buried because they tend to not roll things out elegantly, I'll use that word, was that it's part of a strategy. A WTO case, which may or may not be effective, but that's attracted interest from the EU and from Japan. So it's not entirely true that we've alienated all of our trade partners in this, as well as possible investment restrictions into the US economy, which I think are perfectly reasonable to the extent that China's unwilling to let us fully invest in its economy. And I think the stakes of this are quite high. I disagree with Mr. Dooley that we're protecting anti-competitive or uncompetitive industries. I think a lot of these industries are highly competitive on a man-hour basis, but what they can't compete with is no cost of capital and state-led capitalism. That's extraordinarily difficult. So, do we capitulate? Do we continue a strategy that hasn't borne fruit, which is kind of selected bilateral dialogues that reach agreement but never reach any sort of measurable change in either behavior or metrics? Or do we consider a new, more aggressive approach? And I think we need to do that, in part because it's not just steel and aluminum and some of these other industries. If you look at Made in China 2025, we're talking about autonomous vehicles and advanced batteries and AI and robotics and biotechnology and advanced aerospace platforms and advanced transportation platforms. And these are all of the industries that I think we agree that the U.S. should be competitive in the future. And so as we're establishing this next generation of competition, if it's on the same playing field as the last one was, it's going to be really hard to win that, even if we do the right things domestically, as Congressman Larsen says. And so I think there's a strong argument to be made that, you know, if China is unwilling, unable to engage in any sort of collaborative effort to mitigate these trade tensions, do we somehow have to quarantine the impact that it has on our economy? Because it has been quite severe. In addition to the bilateral trade deficit, I'll grant there are lots of causes for that. You know, the IP Commission estimates we lose about $600 billion a year in our economy, quite measurable because of IP theft. We've seen the jobs impact in manufacturing. David Otter has estimated those impacts, and they've had lasting impacts in these communities. And so I think that tariffs can be part of a broader solution. They can't be the only solution. And it's not easy to win a trade war. I don't think it's easy at all. But we shouldn't back away from it, because if we do, we're really playing into Beijing's hands.
Let me use that as the kicking off point for a little discussion here.